Welcome the Lord's chosen. Pay attention, because what you're about to hear is not motivation. It's an exposure. There are moments in history when entire systems don't collapse because someone fought them. They collapse because someone quietly walked away and proved they were never necessary in the first place. No riots, no shouting, no dramatic battles, just one person stepping outside the script, and suddenly the script stops working. Here's a fact most people don't realize. Every large operation, whether it's social, corporate, political, or psychological, survives on one thing only: participation. Not strength, not intelligence, not force. Participation. The moment enough people stop believing, stop complying, or stop playing along, even the most powerful structure starts wobbling like a cheap plastic chair missing a leg. And that's exactly what happened. You didn't kick the door down. You didn't gather an army. You didn't even announce what you were doing. You simply outgrew what was trying to control you. And somehow, that tiny, quiet shift triggered something massive. People started noticing. They watched how you moved differently, how you stopped reacting, how you stopped begging for approval, how you stopped buying into fear like it was on sale. At first they laughed, then they copied you, then they escaped, one by one, quietly, almost casually, like, wait, we can just leave? That's it? No permission slip. Turns out, yeah, that's it. And when millions start mentally clocking out of a system that depends on their obedience, the people running that system don't throw a party. They panic, because nothing confuses control more than someone who isn't impressed by it. You didn't rebel, you didn't scream, you didn't post 20 angry speeches a day. You just lived free, and that irritated them more than any protest ever could. It's almost funny when you think about it. They built this whole complicated operation: strategies, pressure tactics, manipulation, fear campaigns, and all it took to mess it up was you saying, "Nah, I'm good." Imagine spending years designing a maze and then watching someone casually step over the wall like it's a sidewalk curb. That's the energy. And now they're furious. Not because you attacked them, but because you made them irrelevant. In this video, we're breaking down exactly how you shattered their entire operation without even trying, how your growth quietly freed people you've never met, and why the very thing that makes you different is the same thing that collapsed a system that thought it was untouchable. Stay locked in, because once you see what really happened, you'll never look at your journey or their anger the same way again. Number one, you didn't attack their system, you made it useless. Most people think change happens through loud resistance. They think you have to fight, argue, protest, or go to war with whatever is trying to control you. That's what systems expect. They're prepared for noise. They're prepared for rebels. They're even prepared for outrage. Because when you fight something directly, you're still giving it attention, energy, and importance. You're still playing on their field. But you did something they couldn't prepare for. You stopped playing altogether. You didn't argue with their rules. You didn't try to prove them wrong. You didn't waste time trying to tear the structure down brick by brick. You simply stepped outside of it and built your own way of living. And that single move hit harder than any confrontation ever could. Because systems don't survive on strength. They survive on participation. A job only controls you if you believe you can't walk away. Trends only control you if you feel pressured to follow. Fear only controls you if you keep reacting to it. The moment you stopped needing what they were selling, the approval, the validation, the fake urgency, the "you must do this or else," their leverage disappeared. And that's what made you dangerous to them. You became proof that their grip wasn't real. Other people watched you. They noticed you weren't stressed the same way they were. You weren't chasing the same things. You weren't panicking over the same threats. And slowly, a quiet thought started spreading. If they can live without this, maybe I can too. That's how operations fall apart. Not through explosions, through exits. One person leaves, then 10, then thousands, then millions. No drama, no announcement, just empty chairs where loyal followers used to sit. That's the part that burns them the most. You didn't fight their system and lose. You didn't fight and win either. You did something worse. You made it irrelevant. And nothing collapses faster than something people no longer need. Number 2, your calm exposed how fake their urgency always was. They trained everyone to live like the clock was chasing them with a knife. Hurry, decide now, act fast, don't miss out. You're behind, you're late, you're running out of time. Everything felt like an emergency. And when people feel rushed, they don't think, they react. That's the whole trick. Urgency isn't about efficiency, it's about control, because a rushed mind doesn't question anything. It just obeys whatever voice sounds loudest. That's how they kept people trapped. Constant pressure, constant noise, constant now or never. Then you came along and did something almost disrespectful to their entire setup. You slowed down, not laziness, not carelessness, just calm, steady movement. You stopped treating every message like a fire alarm. You stopped jumping every time someone said, "This is your last chance." You stopped letting deadlines, opinions, and fake expectations push you into panic. And nothing confuses manipulators more than someone who refuses to rush. Because if you can't be rushed, you can't be steered. While everyone else was scrambling, you were thinking. While they were reacting emotionally, you were observing. While they were exhausted, you were steady. That difference was loud, even though you never said a word about it. People started noticing something strange. You weren't falling apart. You weren't anxious all the time. You weren't acting like life was collapsing every 5 minutes. And slowly it hit them. Maybe the pressure wasn't real to begin with. Maybe most of these emergencies were manufactured. Maybe the fear was just marketing. Once that realization spreads, the spell breaks. Because urgency only works when people believe there's no time to breathe. You showed them there was. You proved that life doesn't explode if you pause, that nothing terrible happens when you think before deciding, that most threats disappear when you stop feeding them your energy. Their whole system depended on keeping hearts racing and minds distracted. Your calm lowered the volume, and when the noise dropped, people finally heard the truth. There was never a fire, just a lot of shouting. Number 3, you accidentally taught people how to think without permission. Most people aren't controlled because they're weak. They're controlled because they've been trained to doubt their own mind. From childhood, someone is always standing over them saying, "Don't think too much. Just follow instructions. Trust the experts. Stay in line. This is just how things are." After years of that, people stop questioning anything. Not because they can't think, but because they feel like they're not allowed to. So they outsource their judgment. They wait for someone else to tell them what's right, what's true, what's safe, what's possible. Authority becomes a crutch. If a system says it, it must be correct. If the crowd does it, it must be smart. Then you came in and quietly broke that pattern, not with speeches, not with debates. You just started thinking for yourself out loud. You questioned things people were scared to question. You double-checked information instead of swallowing it. You said, "That doesn't make sense," when something felt off. You changed your mind when new facts showed up. You didn't blindly agree just to fit in. At first, people thought you were stubborn or difficult. But over time, they realized something uncomfortable. You were right, a lot. Not because you were special or psychic, but because you actually used your brain instead of renting someone else's. That's when it hit them. They could do that too. They didn't need permission to analyze something. They didn't need a title or a badge or a crowd backing them to trust their own reasoning. They could ask questions. They could disagree. They could slow down and think. And once a person starts thinking independently, control gets shaky. Because manipulation only works on autopilot minds. You can't easily trick someone who pauses and says, "Hold on, let me look into this." You didn't start a rebellion. You started a habit, and that habit spread. One person thinking clearly turns into 10. 10 turns into thousands. Suddenly people aren't swallowing narratives anymore. They're examining them. That's a nightmare for any system built on blind agreement. All you did was trust your own mind, but without realizing it, you gave everyone else permission to trust theirs too. Number 4, you made obedience look embarrassing. For a long time, following the crowd looked normal, safe, responsible. People were taught that keeping your head down, agreeing with everything, and never rocking the boat was the mature thing to do. Obedience was dressed up like wisdom. Compliance was praised like strength. Anyone who questioned too much was labeled difficult, dramatic, or problematic. So most people learned to shrink themselves. They nodded when they disagreed. They accepted rules that made no sense. They laughed at jokes they didn't find funny. They chased goals they didn't even want, not because they believed in any of it, but because fitting in felt safer than standing alone. Then you showed up and did something simple that quietly flipped the whole script. You stopped pretending. You didn't argue with everyone. You didn't try to be rebellious for attention. You just stopped agreeing with things that felt wrong. You stopped forcing smiles. You stopped bending yourself into shapes just to keep others comfortable. When something didn't align with you, you calmly stepped back instead of folding. No drama, no speeches, just quiet refusal. And somehow, that calm independence hit harder than loud defiance ever could. Because when people looked at you, they didn't see chaos. They saw confidence. You weren't falling apart. You weren't lonely or miserable like they had been warned you would be. You were steady, clear, self-respecting. Meanwhile, they started noticing their own behavior. How quickly they said yes when they meant no. How easily they followed instructions they didn't question. How often they betrayed themselves just to be accepted. And suddenly obedience didn't look noble anymore. It looked weak. It looked like fear. It looked like asking for permission to exist. That realization stung. Because once compliance starts feeling embarrassing instead of safe, everything changes. People stop clapping for blind loyalty. They start admiring backbone. They start respecting the person who stands alone more than the crowd that follows orders. You didn't shame them. Your example did. Without attacking anyone, you made people realize they'd been volunteering their freedom. And nothing threatens a controlling system faster than people deciding they're done acting small just to fit in. Number 5, you survived what was designed to shrink you and came back larger. They expected you to break. Every obstacle, every manipulation, every pressure point they placed in your path was carefully designed to shrink you, to make you doubt yourself, to make you smaller than you really were. Every system, every plan, every strategy was meant to fold you into their version of reality, to control your thoughts, your time, your energy, and your choices. They assumed you would crack under the weight of expectations, insults, and endless demands. They counted on it. They banked on it. But something went differently this time. You survived. Not by pretending, not by giving in, not by faking compliance. You survived because you refused to let their operations define your limits. Every tactic that was supposed to drain you only strengthened your resolve. Every lie, every trap, every attempt to control you became another opportunity to understand just how fragile their system really was. Each challenge didn't diminish you. It clarified your mind, sharpened your instincts, and strengthened your sense of self. And as you grew stronger, others noticed. People who had been quietly watching realized that someone who had faced the same pressures they feared had not only survived, but emerged more confident, more focused, more capable. Your survival became proof that the supposed rules weren't rules at all. They were illusions designed to make everyone else stay small. And when someone witnesses that, it changes their perspective forever. They can't figure it out. They never intended for anyone to endure what you endured and thrive. The system relies on breaking spirits quietly and keeping people compliant without anyone noticing. You broke the pattern. You rewrote the expected outcome, and now they are furious because your existence disproves the narrative they built so carefully. You became proof that pressure doesn't have to shrink you. Trauma doesn't have to silence you. Challenges don't have to trap you. You not only survived, you came back larger, stronger, and untouchable in ways they can't control or even comprehend. And that is terrifying for anyone whose power depends on people staying small. Number 6, you stopped needing to be liked, and which made you impossible to control. Most systems of control, whether in organizations, social groups, or even larger manipulative structures, survive on one simple thing: the desire to be liked. Approval becomes the leash. Compliments are the chains. If someone craves praise, they can be steered. If someone fears rejection, they can be pushed. It's subtle, invisible, but brutally effective. People who need validation are predictable. They will bend, nod, agree, and conform just to stay in favor. That's how influence spreads quietly, without anyone noticing. Then you did the unexpected. You stopped caring, not because you became arrogant or cold, but because you realized your worth wasn't tied to applause, approval, or acceptance. You stopped performing for others. You stopped chasing validation. You stopped begging for permission to exist in their eyes. And that simple shift broke their entire playbook. When someone doesn't need to be liked, they become unpredictable. You can't guilt them. You can't shame them. You can't manipulate them with praise, flattery, or fear. You don't act out of desperation to fit in, so nothing they throw at you lands the way it's supposed to. You are free from the invisible strings that control everyone else, and that freedom shows. People notice it. They feel it. And suddenly, your calm independence makes them question their own compliance. The more they try to pull you back, the more obvious it becomes that their tools don't work. Their threats fall flat. Their flattery feels cheap. Their manipulation becomes transparent. And watching someone move through life untethered and unbothered is like holding up a mirror that no one wants to see. A mirror that exposes their dependence, weakness, and fear. You didn't have to prove anything. You didn't have to shout or fight. You simply stopped needing them. That one quiet choice made you untouchable. And that's what terrifies any system built on obedience and dependence. The moment someone steps off the leash, the illusion of control collapses. You became impossible to predict, impossible to steer, and impossible to contain. Your independence became a force they cannot calculate, and that is why they are furious. Number 7, you exposed how much of society runs on quiet fear. Most people live their lives tiptoeing around invisible boundaries. They make choices based not on desire or logic, but on what they're afraid will happen if they step out of line. Jobs, relationships, social norms, even day-to-day decisions are all driven by fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of being rejected, fear of the unknown. That fear isn't always loud. It's quiet, subtle, almost invisible. And that's what makes it so effective. People don't even realize they're trapped because the cage is made of thoughts, habits, and expectations, not bars. Then you came along and disrupted the pattern. You stopped letting fear dictate your actions. You started doing the things that others secretly wanted to do, but were too scared to risk. You spoke truths people were too polite to say. You walked away from situations that no one dared to leave. You made decisions that looked bold, not because they were reckless, but because they were honest. That kind of behavior acts like a virus to fear. People watch, and suddenly the thought hits, maybe I don't need to be afraid either. When one person acts without fear, it spreads faster than they expect. Quiet observers notice the shift in energy. They see someone taking ownership of their life without permission, without seeking approval, without waiting for safety guarantees. And slowly that quiet courage becomes contagious. People start experimenting with freedom. They pause before saying yes out of obligation. They question rules they've followed blindly for years. They realize the prisons around them were mostly imagined. This is catastrophic for any system built on control. Systems thrive when people stay small, hesitant, and compliant. Once fear starts breaking down, obedience crumbles, manipulation fails, influence diminishes. What you did wasn't loud or revolutionary in the traditional sense. It was a subtle demonstration of what happens when fear no longer dictates your choices. And that subtlety is why it's so devastating. You didn't just escape their influence. You showed millions of people that their own fear was the real trap. And now they're stepping out too. That's why they're furious, because the quiet cage they built is being dismantled from the inside out. Number 8, your presence disrupted their narrative about what success looks like. They spent years building a story about success. They told everyone it meant grinding endlessly, proving yourself constantly, chasing approval, and exhausting yourself in ways that made the system look necessary and impressive. They sold the idea that stress equals productivity, sacrifice equals value, and constant hustle equals legitimacy. That narrative wasn't just a message, it was a trap. It made people work harder for approval they would never fully get and look to the system for permission to live, to rest, and to define their own worth. Then you arrived and quietly dismantled it. You didn't follow the script. You didn't mimic the frantic pace. You didn't spend years proving yourself according to someone else's standards. Instead, you aligned your life with what actually mattered to you. You focused on depth instead of noise, clarity instead of chaos, and progress instead of validation. You made choices that felt right for you. Even if they didn't match the rules everyone had been drilled to follow. And somehow, against all expectations, it worked. People saw it. They noticed you thriving without the endless struggle. They watched you produce results, grow, and live with ease in ways the system said were impossible. And that's dangerous. Because when someone shows that success doesn't require performing, overextending, or begging for approval, it throws the whole manufactured model into question. What they thought was inevitable, stress, sacrifice, endless pursuit, suddenly looks optional. What they taught as the only way suddenly looks like a choice. Your presence alone became proof that their definition of success was neither universal nor necessary. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Quietly, by living differently, you rewrote the rules in plain sight. People began reconsidering their own paths, questioning why they were doing what they were doing, and realizing they could redefine success for themselves. That shift terrifies systems built on control, because when the definition of success changes, the power of authority diminishes. You didn't need to confront anyone directly. You didn't need to criticize or challenge. You simply existed on your own terms. And that existence shattered the narrative that kept millions trapped in the illusion of how things must be. Number 9, you made manipulation easier to spot. Most people don't realize how much of life is built on subtle manipulation. From the way information is delivered, to the tone of someone's voice, to the little social pressures and expectations that constantly nudge behavior, systems rely on people not noticing they're being influenced. The trick isn't force or intimidation, it's invisibility. If no one sees it, no one resists it. That's why manipulative operations thrive quietly. They don't need to be overt. They just need people to keep playing along, reacting automatically, and trusting the script without pause. Then you appeared and did the thing they didn't plan for. You started noticing patterns. You started analyzing actions, questioning motives, and separating genuine intentions from manufactured pressure. You weren't combative. You weren't dramatic. You simply observed and responded with clarity. The people around you began to notice. They realized that what once seemed normal, the subtle coercion, the hidden agendas, the expectations that weren't spoken but still demanded compliance, was actually manipulation. And once people notice manipulation, it loses its power. It spread quickly. One person spotting the tricks is enough to start a ripple. Others begin questioning conversations, meetings, even casual interactions. They notice the inconsistencies, the hidden pushes, and the emotional hooks. Suddenly, things that used to feel inevitable start to feel optional. Obedience starts to feel like a choice, not a necessity. And when enough people realize this, the system itself begins to crumble quietly from the inside out. Your awareness didn't just protect you, it educated others without words. You became a living example that the rules weren't unbreakable, the pressure wasn't unavoidable, and the control wasn't absolute. People started thinking for themselves and noticing what they had never noticed before. That's why the people running the operation are furious. They can handle resistance, they see, but they cannot handle enlightenment spreading quietly and subtly. You didn't fight them. You simply opened eyes, and once people see clearly, manipulation loses every ounce of its effectiveness. You exposed the invisible, and the system started to wobble under its own illusions. Number 10, you refused to play the victim role they assigned you. Most systems, whether personal, social, or institutional, rely on people staying small. They want predictable, compliant, and reactive individuals who can be managed emotionally. One of the most effective ways to maintain that control is to cast people into a role, usually the victim role. Once someone is labeled as weak, broken, or dependent, they become easier to manipulate. Others start feeling pity, anger, or pressure to intervene on their behalf, and the person in that role is stuck performing a script they didn't choose. Systems thrive on this. They rely on people staying inside the box they built, reacting exactly as expected. You refused to step into that box. You didn't argue with the label. You didn't justify yourself, and you didn't let it define your next moves. You didn't stay angry, bitter, or broken, because that's what they expected. You healed, grew, and moved forward on your own terms. By refusing victimhood, you robbed them of the leverage they assumed they had over you. They had prepared for someone to crumble, to beg, to resent, to fight, or to complain endlessly. Instead, you showed up stronger, calmer, and clearer. This refusal is dangerous to manipulative systems because victims are predictable. They can be corralled, guilted, manipulated, and steered. But someone who refuses to play that role becomes unpredictable. You set your own boundaries. You made your own choices. You controlled your own narrative. Nothing they could throw at you mattered in the same way anymore, and people around you noticed. Observers realized that suffering doesn't have to define anyone. Trauma, manipulation, or pressure doesn't need to control the outcome of someone's life. Seeing you refuse the victim script inspired others, and suddenly the whole operation started to look weaker. You didn't have to confront anyone to win. You simply refused the role they assigned, and by doing so, you became untouchable in ways they could never anticipate. That is why they are furious. They planned for every scenario except one, you refusing to be their pawn. You rewrote the expectations quietly, but irreversibly, and nothing they do can take that away. Number 11. You became proof that freedom doesn't require permission. Most people live their lives waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for the perfect timing, waiting for someone to approve their choices, waiting for someone to tell them they're ready. Society trains people to believe that freedom is conditional, that it comes with approval, validation, or a stamp of permission from someone who claims authority. Careers, relationships, and even personal decisions are all packaged with invisible strings, and most people accept them without question because they've been taught to. Then you appeared and quietly broke that pattern. You stopped waiting. You stopped asking for permission to live on your own terms. You didn't wait for approval from a system, a crowd, or an authority figure. You simply acted. You moved. You decided. You chose, and you lived in alignment with your own truth. That alone is revolutionary, because it goes against the entire structure that keeps people small and dependent. Your actions weren't loud or theatrical. You didn't need to announce your independence or prove it to anyone. You just lived it. And what happened next was extraordinary. People started noticing that life didn't explode around you. Doors opened, opportunities appeared, and growth happened without anyone allowing it. That's when the subtle but devastating realization hit. Freedom doesn't come from someone else. It never did. The permission people had been waiting for their whole lives was an illusion. This is catastrophic for any system built on control. Systems rely on dependency, on people waiting for approval to move forward. The moment someone demonstrates that freedom is available without asking, it undermines the entire framework. Suddenly, millions of people begin questioning the rules they thought were unbreakable, and the supposed authority loses its grip. You didn't have to declare war. You didn't need to convince anyone. You became living proof that waiting is optional, that freedom is inherent, and that no one holds the keys except the person daring enough to act. And that simple truth terrifies systems that profit from compliance, because once people see it, they can't unsee it. You changed the game just by moving forward. Number 12, your authenticity made their personas look fake. Most people are trained to perform. From early on, society rewards the masks, the smiles you plaster on even when you're frustrated, the polite nods when you disagree, the rehearsed responses that make you blend in. Systems, manipulative networks, and controlling operations all depend on performance. They rely on people acting, pretending, and presenting a version of themselves that fits neatly into the expectations and rules designed to keep control. Masks are predictable, manageable, and easy to influence. Authenticity, on the other hand, is unpredictable, uncomfortable, and contagious. Then you showed up, simply being real. You didn't perform to impress. You didn't act to fit a mold or to gain approval. You spoke and moved according to what felt true to you, even if it went against the script everyone expected. There was no exaggeration, no overcuration, no hidden agenda, just raw clarity in how you carried yourself. And that quiet realness immediately exposed everyone else's effort to perform. What once looked normal suddenly looked overdone, forced, or fragile. Your presence became a mirror that reflected the truth. Most of what people were presenting was a carefully built illusion. People noticed. They started questioning their own behavior and the behavior of those around them. They realized how much effort went into pretending to be someone they weren't. And when authenticity enters a room, performance begins to crumble. The more you stayed true to yourself, the more obvious it became which identities were built on fear, expectation, or manipulation. For systems dependent on compliance and control, this is disastrous. Performance can be guided, manipulated, and predicted. Authenticity cannot. By simply existing as yourself, you made the polished facades look cheap and fragile. You didn't attack anyone's masks, but you shattered their power quietly. People around you began valuing realness over appearances, substance over image, and truth over convenience. Your authenticity didn't just make you untouchable. It forced everyone else to see how unnecessary all the pretenses were. And nothing enrages a manipulative system more than realizing its carefully constructed illusions are meaningless in the face of someone who refuses to play along. Number 13, you didn't recruit people. People followed your example naturally. Most systems rely on active persuasion. They plan speeches, campaigns, rallies, and strategies to convince people to join, comply, or take sides. They rely on effort, on pressure, on marketing, on carefully crafted narratives. That's the playbook everyone expects. You convince people to act, and then you control their participation. It's loud, calculated, and exhausting. Then you did something they couldn't predict. You didn't try to convince anyone. You didn't rally crowds. You didn't argue, debate, or create campaigns. You simply lived your life in a way that made sense to you. You pursued your goals, followed your principles, and stayed aligned with what you knew was right. You focused on your growth, your clarity, and your independence. That quiet consistency created something far more powerful than any recruitment effort. Influence by example. People noticed. They started to observe how you handled challenges, how you responded to pressure, how you moved through life without bending to fear or approval. They noticed your calm, your focus, your results, and your refusal to perform for anyone else. And something remarkable happened. They began to emulate you. They didn't need a speech, a call to action, or a recruitment pitch. Your example was compelling enough. Your way of living became the standard they wanted to follow. This type of influence is terrifying to systems that rely on manipulation. Recruitment is controlled. Influence by example is organic. It spreads naturally, quietly, and irreversibly. People don't copy out of obligation. They copy because they see a better way. And once that happens, a system loses control not because of confrontation, but because people choose to walk away. You didn't need to convince anyone. You didn't need to fight for attention or approval. The people around you simply followed because they saw something they wanted for themselves. That's how revolutions happen quietly, without announcements, without leaders, without battles. Your life became the proof, the guide, and the trigger. And that is exactly why those who tried to control everything are furious. They trained for resistance, but they couldn't train for inspiration. You changed the game without even trying. Number 14, you didn't destroy their operation with force. You made it irrelevant. Most people assume that to dismantle a system, you have to attack it head-on, fight it, expose it publicly, or confront it with aggression. That's what they expect. Revolutions, battles, and uprisings are loud, messy, and visible. And systems are prepared for that. They know how to survive chaos, arguments, protests, and attacks. They can push back against force, intimidate rebels, and even recover from temporary disruptions. What you did, however, was far more devastating. You didn't need to fight. You didn't need to scream, campaign, or organize. You simply lived outside their rules. You stopped participating. You refused to engage in the behaviors, fears, and expectations that the system relied on to maintain its power. You made their influence optional. You made their rules meaningless. And once enough people noticed, their operation didn't just face resistance. It became irrelevant. This is catastrophic for any system built on control. Systems thrive on participation, compliance, and belief. Remove those, and the structure collapses quietly, invisibly but permanently. Empty chairs, disengaged followers, people thinking for themselves. All of that erodes power faster than confrontation ever could. It's not dramatic, but it's unstoppable. And that is exactly what you achieved. By refusing to play by their rules, you showed everyone around you that the system wasn't necessary. You revealed that people could live, grow, and succeed without it. You turned attention away from them and toward freedom, independence, and self-alignment. And when people no longer see a reason to follow, manipulate, or obey, influence loses all meaning. They are furious not because they were attacked, They are furious because their operation, built on careful planning and control, no longer matters. You didn't destroy it, you outgrew it. You didn't have to convince anyone. You simply proved that life outside their operation is possible, sustainable, and better. And that is a type of collapse that can't be fixed, argued with, or rebuilt. You didn't fight the system. You made it irrelevant, and there is no defense against that. Everything we've uncovered today leads to one undeniable truth. The reason they are furious isn't that you fought them, argued with them, or even tried to expose them. It's far deeper than that. The reason they rage, panic, and scramble is because you became untouchable in ways they could never anticipate. You didn't play their game. You didn't react to their pressure. You didn't fight for attention or validation. You simply lived your life with clarity, courage, and uncompromising alignment with your own truth. Every quiet choice you made, refusing victimhood, stopping the chase for approval, moving with calm instead of panic, thinking for yourself, chipped away at the foundation they built. And as each of these choices compounded, something extraordinary happened. Millions of people began seeing the cracks, questioning the rules, and discovering their own freedom. You didn't need to force change. You didn't need to lead movements or stage confrontations. You became the proof, the living example, the spark that made their entire operation collapse from irrelevance. And here's the most powerful part. What you achieved is permanent. Systems can recover from chaos, fear, and noise. They can withstand anger,